The desert didn't care about promises. It just stretched out, red and endless, like a wound that wouldn't heal. The sun was bleeding out on the horizon, setting the dust on fire, and a single wagon was crawling through it all, groaning its way to a town that was little more than a smudge of failure in the distance. Inside that wagon, a young woman sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, her shoulders covered by a faded shawl. The patterns woven into it were the story of her people, stitched by a mother she would never see again. She was 22, but her eyes were ancient. The settlers didn't use her name. They didn't care to learn it. To them, she was just the Apache bride, a piece of a bargain, something to be whispered about, a bad omen. She held her head high, a silent strength that made them uncomfortable. It reminded them that this land wasn't given, it was taken, and she was a ghost of that truth. The wagon wheels hit the rutted main street, and the whole town seemed to stop and stare. Wooden buildings leaned on each other like tired old men. Every window held a pair of eyes, and every pair of eyes was filled with judgment. A widow clutched her bonnet and spat a whisper to her friend. The bartender paused, a dirty glass in his hand. Kids pointed. She lowered her gaze, not because she was ashamed, but because there was no point in looking into eyes that had already decided who she was. And then she saw him, the man who'd promised to marry her. He was standing on the saloon porch, big and proud. His boots were shined, his belt buckle a piece of polished silver. He waited until the wagon stopped, until the whole town was watching, and then his mouth twisted into a sneer. He looked her up and down like she was a lame horse he'd been tricked into buying. "Not fit," he said. The words were loud. They were meant to be. He spat them into the dirt. "Not fit for me, not for any man here." The air went still. The silence was heavier than the heat. She didn't move, didn't speak. To argue would be to give him a victory. The shawl slipped from one shoulder, and she lifted her chin just an inch. But it was enough. Someone gasped. A boy snickered. And just like that, the rancher turned his back on her and walked into the saloon. The doors swung shut behind him, swallowing him in a wave of cheap whiskey and cruel laughter. She was left there, alone in the street, unwanted, unclaimed. But she wasn't broken. She turned and began to walk, her footsteps silent in the dust. She walked past the murmuring crowd, past the church where the preacher stood frozen on the steps, his mouth open but no words coming out. He looked like he wanted to say something, offer a prayer or a kindness, but his courage failed him. He just watched her go. But at the edge of town, away from the others, another man was waiting. He was older, maybe 30, with a face carved by sun and hardship. A cowboy. He wasn't part of the crowd. He was just watching, and his eyes weren't filled with judgment. They were filled with a sadness that recognized her own. As she got closer, he stepped forward. He didn't offer pity. He didn't say a word. He just held out a metal canteen. She paused, her whole body tense. She searched his face for the trick, for the hidden cruelty she had come to expect from his kind. But there was nothing, just a quiet patience, like he could stand there all day waiting for her to trust him. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the canteen. Her hand was trembling, but the cool water soothed the fire in her throat. "You'll not be left in the dust," he said, his voice as quiet as the desert night. "Not while I still draw breath." It wasn't a promise. Not really. It was something smaller, something more real. A single seed of hope planted in the barren soil of her despair. She handed the canteen back, her eyes still lowered, and he just nodded. The people in the town started whispering again when they saw him lead her away. "A fool's kindness," someone muttered. But the cowboy didn't look back. He just walked, his stride steady, and she followed, pulling her shawl tight around her, not sure if this was rescue or just another kind of cage. They walked west, away from the town, until the last building was gone, and it was just them and the endless sky. The ranch was small, just a simple house made of weathered wood that stood against the wind like it had no choice. A single lantern glowed in the window, a tiny spark of warmth in the vast, empty dark. He pushed the door open, the old wood groaning a welcome, and stood aside. She hesitated on the threshold. It had been so long since a roof had been offered to her without a price attached. She clutched the shawl, her heart a tangled knot of fear and a fragile, unfamiliar hope. The cowboy, he just waited. He didn't push her, didn't rush her. He just stood there, his presence as solid and real as the land itself. And in that quiet moment, something inside her shifted. It wasn't love. It was something far more important. It was the faint, flickering beginning of belief. She took a breath, stepped over the threshold, and into the light. The door closed behind her, and the desert held its breath, waiting to see if this one small act of mercy could survive in a world so determined to crush it. But the desert keeps its secrets, and this night was just the beginning. The days that followed were quiet. She learned the rhythms of his life, a life lived in silence and hard work. She would rise before the sun to care for the horses, her touch gentle, her presence calming. He would already be out mending a fence or chopping wood, the sound of his axe a steady heartbeat on the quiet land. They barely spoke. They didn't need to. He'd find a clean, mended shirt laid out for him. She'd find a small bunch of wildflowers left on the porch railing. It was a language all their own. But the town hadn't forgotten her. Every trip for supplies was a fresh wound. The women would turn their backs. The men would stare. Children, learning their parents' hate, would throw pebbles that bounced harmlessly off her skirts. Once, a woman spat on the ground in front of the church as she passed. The preacher saw it. He just looked away. She never flinched, never cried out. She just kept walking, her back straight, even as the weight of their scorn pressed down on her. And he was always there. He never fought for her, not with his fists. His protection was quieter, stronger. He would just walk beside her, and his steady, unwavering gaze was enough to silence the drunks and shame the cruel. He gave her back the dignity they tried so hard to steal. But a question haunted her in the quiet hours of the night. Was she just his charity project? A stray he'd taken in out of pity? She needed to know that he saw her, not just a cause. Then the storm came. It wasn't just rain. It was a war. The sky turned black, and lightning tore it open. The wind screamed, and from the corral came the sound of splintering wood and a horse's terrified cry. It was the wild stallion, a creature of pure fire and rage that no one in the county had been able to break. The storm had driven it mad. It was trying to kill itself against the fence. Without a second thought, she ran out into the fury. The rain plastered her hair to her face, the mud sucking at her feet. The stallion was a nightmare of flashing hooves and rolling eyes. The townsfolk, drawn by the chaos, were gathering at the edge of the property, their faces pale in the lightning flashes. "She's a goner," one of them yelled over the wind. "Let the beast be." But she didn't stop, and then he was there beside her, a lantern held high, the rain pouring off the brim of his hat. Their eyes met across the raging storm, and a silent understanding passed between them. He moved to the left, slow and steady. She moved to the right, and then she began to speak. Not in English, but in the soft, flowing tongue of her mother, the language of the Apache. The words were ancient, words of respect for the horse's spirit, words of calm. The stallion stopped its frantic bucking. Its ears twitched. It listened. The rage in its eyes began to fade, replaced by a weary confusion. She lifted her hand, palm open, and slowly the great beast lowered its head. She touched its wet muzzle, whispering to it, and the storm inside the horse finally broke. The crowd was silent. They had just watched the woman they despised do the impossible. The woman they called a savage had just shown them a power they couldn't comprehend. When the rain finally softened to a drizzle, he stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. His voice was thick with emotion. "This place," he said, so low only she could hear, "it's not a home without you in it." And just like that, the last of her doubts were washed away. She wasn't a burden. She was chosen. A few weeks later, the church bell rang for her. She walked down the same aisle where people had once sneered, but this time they were silent. She wore a simple white dress, and he stood at the altar, his face solemn and proud. When the preacher spoke her new name, her husband's name, it echoed through the church, a sound of thunder that finally washed away all the whispers and the hate. When they walked out into the sun, the town was watching. But they weren't just watching an outcast anymore. They were watching a woman who had found her place, a woman who had refused to be broken. She carried her shawl folded over her arm, not as a shield, but as a reminder of who she was and all she had overcome. But the peace was a fragile thing, as thin as a desert mirage. One afternoon, while her husband, Caleb, was out checking the far fences, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was Bartholomew, the rancher who had cast her aside. He wasn't alone. He had 5 men with him, and they weren't coming for a friendly visit. She watched them from the window, her heart turning to ice. She barred the door and grabbed the old shotgun Caleb kept over the fireplace. It was heavy, unfamiliar in her hands. Bartholomew rode right up to the porch. "Woman!" he bellowed. "I know you're in there. I've come for what's mine." She didn't answer. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was like iron. "Don't play dumb with me," he sneered. "The map, the old chief's map. I know you have it." A map? She had no idea what he was talking about. Her father had been a chief, a great warrior, but he had left her nothing but memories and a faded shawl. The men dismounted, spreading out to surround the small house. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about something else. Greed. Bartholomew must have heard some rumor, some tall tale about a hidden Apache treasure, and he believed she was the key. Suddenly, a shot rang out, but it didn't come from the house. One of Bartholomew's men cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. Caleb. He was on the ridge behind the house, his rifle smoking. "Get away from my wife," he yelled, his voice carrying across the plains, cold and deadly. Bartholomew's men scrambled for cover, firing blindly toward the ridge, the air filled with the crack of gunfire. She knew she couldn't just hide. Caleb was outnumbered. She ran to the back window, rested the heavy shotgun on the sill, took a deep breath, and fired at the man closest to the barn. The kickback slammed her against the wall, but the man went down. The fight was furious, but short. Caleb was a terrifyingly good shot, moving from rock to rock like a ghost. Soon, it was just him and Bartholomew. The big rancher, realizing his men were down and he was exposed, threw down his gun and mounted his horse, digging his heels in and riding away in a panic. When Caleb finally came inside, his face was grim. He wasn't just a simple cowboy. No simple cowboy could fight like that. He looked at her, at the shotgun still clutched in her hands, and then at the body of the man she had shot, lying still in the dust. "Who are you, Caleb?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. "My name is Caleb Thorne," he said heavily, "and I used to be a Pinkerton agent." The name meant little to her, but the look in his eyes told her everything. He had a past, a violent one. "I was hired by a man named Elias Thorne, the railroad baron. He wanted this land, all of it. He'd heard the stories, the same ones Bartholomew heard. Stories of your father's hidden gold." Her mind reeled. The railroad, the gold. It all felt like a fever dream. "There is no gold," she said. "I know," Caleb replied. "But Thorne doesn't believe that. He sent me to get close to you, to find the map he was convinced your father left you. He couldn't meet her eyes. My job was to find it, no matter what it took. But when I saw you in that town, when I saw what they did to you, I couldn't do it. I quit. I sent word to Thorne that the stories were a lie, and I was done. He finally looked at her, his face filled with shame. I thought he'd give up. I never thought he'd send someone like Bartholomew. So his kindness hadn't been simple. It had been born from a guilty conscience. Her rescue had been a lie. He had been sent to use her. The thought was a fresh betrayal, a wound deeper than any insult the town could throw at her. She felt the fragile trust between them shatter into a million pieces. "Is anything you told me true?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Everything that mattered," he said desperately. "The way I feel, that's true." But his words were lost in the roar of her own pain. She turned away from him, walking to the window and staring out at the land that had promised her a new life, a new beginning. But the desert keeps its secrets. And she was beginning to realize that the man she married was the biggest secret of all. She felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. The fight wasn't over. Bartholomew was just a pawn. The real monster, Elias Thorne, was still out there. And now he knew that she wouldn't be easy prey. He would be coming for her. And this time, he wouldn't send a fool like Bartholomew. He would send killers. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in a chair by the cold fireplace, the shotgun across her lap, watching Caleb as he slept fitfully in their bed. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Was he telling the truth now? Or was this just another more complicated lie to keep her compliant? He had betrayed his mission for her, he said, but he had accepted the mission in the first place. He had looked at her people's tragedy and seen it as a job. Morning came, gray and grim. The body of the man she'd shot was still out there, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered their quiet life. Caleb woke and saw her sitting there, her face a mask of exhaustion and mistrust. He didn't try to make excuses. He just got up, went outside, and began digging a grave. As she watched him, she felt a strange shift inside her. He could have left. After the fight, he could have ridden off and disappeared, leaving her to face Thorne's wrath alone. But he stayed. He was digging a grave for a man he'd helped kill, to protect a woman he'd been sent to betray. The world was no longer simple. There were no purely good men, no purely evil ones. There was just the mess of what people did. She went outside, not to him, but to the small corral. The wild stallion watched her, its eyes intelligent, curious. She had soothed its wildness. Could she soothe the wildness in her own heart? She reached into a pocket and pulled out a small, intricately beaded pouch her mother had given her. It held nothing of value, just a few dried herbs for tea, a smooth river stone. But as she held it, an idea sparked. A desperate, dangerous idea. Bartholomew thought she had a map. Thorne thought she had a map. What if she did? She went back inside and took her shawl, the one her mother had made. The patterns were complex, a series of lines and symbols that told the stories of her ancestors. But to an outsider, to a greedy man desperate for gold, it could look like something else entirely. She took a piece of charcoal from the fireplace, and with a trembling hand, she began to alter the pattern. She added a new line here, a circle there, making the design look even more like a cryptic chart. It was a lie, a trap, but it was the only weapon she had. Caleb came back inside, his hands dirty, his face tired. He saw what she was doing. "What is that?" he asked. "It's the map," she said, her voice flat. "It's the map they want, so we're going to give it to them." He stared at her, then at the altered shawl. He understood immediately. "You're going to lead them on a wild goose chase, into the Badlands." "I'm going to lead them somewhere they won't come back from," she corrected him. "You know this land, but I know this land. My people have lived here for 1,000 years. There are places out there. Places that kill you if you don't know the way." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. It was the first time she had seen him smile since the shooting. "Elias Thorne is a patient man," he said. "He won't just send thugs next time. He'll send his best. A man named Silas Kane. He was my commander at the Pinkertons. He's not a man, he's a hunting dog. Once he has a scent, he never lets go." "Good," she said, her voice like flint. "Let him come. Let them all come." The plan was terrifyingly simple. They would flee, making it look like a panicked escape. They would leave the shawl behind, draped over a chair as if forgotten in their haste. The fake map would lead Thorne's men deep into a treacherous, winding canyon system known to the Apache as the Bone Eater. It was a maze of dead ends, hidden sinkholes, and sheer cliffs, where the sun could bake a man to death in hours and the nights were freezing cold. There was only one safe path through, a path known only to her people. They packed light, water, dried meat, rifles. As they were about to leave, Caleb stopped her. He held out a pistol, a small, concealable one. "I should have given you this sooner," he said. "I hope you never have to use it." She took it, the cold metal a heavy reality in her palm. This was her life now. They rode out at dusk, heading east to throw off any immediate pursuit before circling back west toward the mountains. They didn't look back at the small ranch house that had been their sanctuary. It was tainted now. As they rode, a new kind of silence settled between them. It wasn't the comfortable silence of before. It was the tense, focused silence of two soldiers heading into battle. She still didn't trust him completely, but she knew in this fight they were on the same side. Their survival depended on it. 2 days later, hiding in a rocky outcrop, they saw them. A dozen riders, moving with grim efficiency. At the lead was a man on a big black horse. Even from a distance, he radiated an aura of cold menace. Silas Kane. They had taken the bait, they had the shawl. Now, the trap was set. Caleb watched them through a small spyglass, his face pale. "He has more men than I thought," he murmured. "Thorne wants you dead, but he wants that gold more. He'll have told Kane to bring you back alive if possible." The thought made her blood run cold. She wasn't just being hunted, she was being captured. The chase was on. For the next week they lived like ghosts. They traveled by night, using the stars to guide them, resting during the blistering heat of the day in caves and under rocky ledges. She taught Caleb the secrets of the desert, how to find water by watching the flight of birds, which plants were safe to eat, how to move without leaving a trace. He, in turn, taught her how to reload the pistol quickly, how to anticipate an ambush. They were becoming a team, their shared danger forging a new, stronger bond between them. But Kane was good. He was relentless. Several times they spotted his scouts, forcing them to change their route, costing them precious time and water. The canyon was still 2 days away, and their canteens were getting dangerously low. One evening, as they made a cold camp in a narrow ravine, Caleb suddenly tensed. "What is it?" she whispered. "Smoke," he said, sniffing the air. "And not a campfire." It was faint, but it was there, the smell of a cigar. Kane was close, far closer than they thought. Suddenly, the ravine was filled with the sound of barking. Not coyotes, hounds. Silas Kane hadn't just brought men. He'd brought tracking dogs. The hunt had just become terrifyingly personal. They couldn't outrun dogs. They scrambled from the ravine, jumping from rock to break their scent trail, the sound of the baying hounds echoing behind them, getting closer and closer. There was nowhere to run. They were caught on a wide, open mesa, the ground lit by a full moon. The hounds were closing in, followed by the dark shapes of men on horseback. "This is it," Caleb said, cocking his rifle. "We make our stand here." But she shook her head, her eyes scanning the landscape frantically. There had to be another way. And then she saw it. A dark line against the horizon, a herd of wild mustangs grazing peacefully under the moon. "The horses," she whispered. "The stallion." She started to hum, a low, ancient melody her mother had taught her for calming animals. Caleb looked at her like she was crazy, but he kept quiet. The mustangs' heads came up. They listened, their ears twitching. The lead stallion, a magnificent black creature, took a step toward them. The baying of the hounds was getting louder, closer. The riders were cresting the hill. She kept humming, her voice growing stronger, weaving a spell of trust in the cold night air. The lead stallion snorted, then began to walk toward them, the rest of the herd following. It was a terrible risk. The herd could trample them, but it was their only chance. "When I say run," she told Caleb, "run with them." The horses were just yards away now, their powerful bodies surrounding them. The hounds broke over the rise, spotting them, their barking reaching a fever pitch. "Now!" she screamed. At the same moment, the lead stallion let out a piercing cry and bolted, not away from the danger, but straight toward it. The entire herd surged forward in a thundering stampede. Caleb and she were swept up in the middle of it, running with the wild horses, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Cain's men were thrown into chaos. Their horses, panicked by the stampede, reared and bucked. The hounds scattered. In the confusion, under the cover of the dust and the pounding hooves, they escaped. They ran with the herd for miles until, exhausted and breathless, the mustangs slowed and they were able to slip away into the darkness, leaving a baffled Silas Cain and his hunters far behind. They had survived. But now Cain knew he wasn't just hunting a woman. He was hunting someone who could command the very spirit of the desert. And that would only make him more determined to capture her. They reached the entrance to the Bone Eater Canyon the next day, their bodies bruised, their water gone. The place was aptly named. The rocks were bleached white, shaped by the wind into jagged teeth. The air was still and hot, and the silence was absolute. It felt like a tomb. "Once we go in," she said, looking at Caleb, "there's only one way out, and if we make a mistake, we die in here." "I trust you," he said simply. The words hung in the air, a new promise, one that felt real this time. They entered the maze. The fake map on the shawl was designed to be plausible at first, leading Cain and his men down the main wide canyon. But its instructions would soon send them into dead ends, into box canyons with no water sources, deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. Her true path was different. It involved climbing rock faces that looked impassable, squeezing through cracks in the stone barely wide enough for a person, and navigating by the position of the sun against specific rock formations her ancestors had used as markers. For 3 days they moved through the canyon. It was a brutal, punishing journey. The heat was relentless, and the lack of water was a constant torment. On the 3rd day, Caleb stumbled, his face ashen. He was severely dehydrated. He couldn't go on. "Leave me," he rasped, his voice cracking. "Save yourself." She refused. She remembered a story her grandfather had told her about a hidden spring, a place sacred to her people, said to be deep within the Bone Eater. But the stories said it was guarded by a spirit. She had always thought it was a legend, a children's tale. But now it was their only hope. Leaving Caleb hidden in a small cave, she went in search of it, following the faint clues from the old story. She found it hours later, in a place no one would ever think to look, a deep cavern hidden behind a curtain of dried vines. Inside, it was cool and dark, and in the center, a small pool of water, crystal clear, bubbled up from the rock. As she knelt to drink, she felt a presence. She looked up and saw him, sitting on a ledge in the darkness. An old Apache warrior, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes as bright as a hawk's. He held a long spear in his hand. He wasn't a spirit. He was real. He spoke to her in the old dialect, a language she hadn't heard spoken so purely since she was a child. He was a guardian, the last of a small band who had taken refuge in this canyon years ago, choosing to live in secret rather than be forced onto a reservation. He had been watching her. He had seen her guiding Caleb, seen the hunters following them. He knew who she was. Her father had been his friend. She told him everything, about Thorn, the fake map, and the trap they had set. The old warrior, whose name was Chayton, listened patiently. When she was finished, he nodded. "The men who follow you are trapped," he said. "The canyon has them now. They will wander until the sun takes them. But their leader, the one you call Cain, he is different. He does not think like the others. He thinks like a wolf. He will not be fooled for long." Chayton led her back to Caleb, bringing water in a clay jar. As Caleb drank, the old warrior studied him. "You have a white man's face," Chayton said to him in broken English, "but an Apache's heart. You fight for her." It wasn't a question. Just as Caleb was regaining his strength, they heard it. A single gunshot echoing through the canyon walls. It was a signal. Then another, from a different direction. Chayton's face grew grim. "Cain has figured it out," he said. "He knows he was tricked. He is testing the canyon, searching for the true path." The hunter was not just following them. He was adapting. He was learning the secrets of the maze. The trap had failed. Now they were the ones who were trapped, caught between Silas Cain and the back of the canyon, with nowhere left to run. The hunter had become the hunted. Chayton led them deeper into the network of caves, his movements swift and silent. The gunshots were getting closer. Cain was using them to map the canyon's acoustics, triangulating their position. He wasn't just a hunting dog. He was a master strategist. "He is driving us," Caleb said, his voice low, "forcing us toward a kill zone." Chayton stopped at the entrance to a large, open cavern that looked out over a sheer 1,000-foot drop. "Here," the old warrior said, "we make our stand." It looked like a death trap. They would be cornered, with their backs to the abyss. But Chayton pointed to the far wall of the cavern. A series of tiny, almost invisible handholds and footholds were carved into the rock, leading down the cliff face. It was an ancient escape route. "He will expect us to be trapped here," Chayton explained. "He will come in confident, but we will not be here." The plan was set. They would wait in the shadows of the cavern entrance. When Cain and his men entered, Chayton would create a diversion. In the confusion, Caleb and she would make their way to the cliff face and begin the perilous descent. It was their only way out. Moments later, they appeared. Silas Cain and the 5 men he had left. The others had presumably already been claimed by the Bone Eater. Cain moved with a predatory grace, his pistol drawn. He scanned the cavern, a cruel smile on his lips. "Nowhere left to hide, Thorn," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. He still thought Caleb was the one in charge. Suddenly, a spear flew out of the darkness, embedding itself in the chest of the man next to Cain. Chayton let out a fierce war cry and charged from the shadows, a knife flashing in his hand. Cain's men, startled, opened fire. It was the diversion they needed. "Go now," Caleb urged, pushing her toward the cliff wall. She found the first handhold, her fingers trembling. The rock was slick, the drop terrifying. Caleb was right behind her. Below them, the cavern was chaos. Chayton was a whirlwind of motion, but he was outnumbered. She saw him go down, overwhelmed by Cain's men. A cry of grief and rage escaped her lips, but there was no time to mourn. They had to keep moving. They were halfway down the cliff face when a head appeared over the ledge above them. It was Silas Cain. He had seen them. He aimed his pistol, not at Caleb, but at her. "The girl is more valuable alive, Thorn," he shouted down, "but I'm not a patient man." Before he could fire, Caleb, who was just below her, did something incredible. He let go with one hand, drew his own pistol, and fired upwards. The shot was a miracle. It struck Kane's hand, sending his gun flying. Kane howled in pain and staggered back from the edge. They scrambled the rest of the way down, collapsing onto a narrow ledge at the bottom of the cliff. They were alive, but they were not safe. Kane knew where they were. He would find another way down. They had bought themselves time, nothing more. And she had a horrifying realization. Kane had called Caleb Thorn. Why would he do that? "He called you Thorn," she said, her breath ragged. Caleb wouldn't look at her. "Caleb, why did he call you Thorn?" He finally turned to face her, and his expression was one of complete despair. "Because Elias Thorn is my father," he said. The world stopped. Every act of kindness, every shared danger, every moment of trust, it was all a lie, built on a foundation of deceit so profound she couldn't even comprehend it. He wasn't a rogue agent who had defied his boss. He was the son of the monster who had been hunting her from the very beginning. The man she had married, the man she had started to love, was her greatest enemy. The betrayal was so absolute, it left her breathless. "Your father sent you to find me?" she stammered, the words tasting like ash. "Yes," Caleb admitted, his voice hollow. "It was supposed to be a test. My final test to prove I was worthy of taking over his empire. Find the Apache gold, secure the land for the railroad, and dispose of the girl." The last words were barely a whisper. He was supposed to kill her. This whole journey, this entire relationship, had been a prelude to her own murder. "But I couldn't," he said desperately, taking a step toward her. She flinched back, raising the small pistol he had given her, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. "When I met you, everything changed. I saw what he was, what I was becoming. I chose you. I've been fighting him, fighting Kane, to protect you." His words were a torrent, but she could barely hear them over the roaring in her ears. He was Elias Thorne's son. He had come to her with a lie on his lips and murder in his heart. Did he really change? Or was this just the final, most cruel deception? Was he trying to get her to lower the gun so he could finish the job his father had given him? Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were on a narrow ledge at the bottom of a canyon, with a killer above them and a liar in front of her. Suddenly, a rope snaked down the cliff face 100 yards away. Kane was coming. They had seconds to decide. "If we're going to live," Caleb said, his eyes pleading with her, "we have to live together. You have to trust me. One last time." She looked from his desperate face to the descending figure of Silas Kane, and then at the pistol in her own hand. The desert had taught her that survival sometimes meant making alliances with things you feared. She lowered the gun, but she didn't put it away. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. He pointed along the ledge. It narrowed until it disappeared into a dark slit in the rock. A cave. "In there," he said. "It's our only chance." As they scrambled toward the cave entrance, Kane reached the bottom of the cliff and opened fire. The bullets ricocheted off the rock around them, showering them with stone chips. They dove into the darkness of the cave just as Kane and his remaining men reached the ledge. The cave was not a cave. It was a tunnel, sloping steeply downwards into the blackness. The air grew cold and damp. Soon they could hear the sound of rushing water. The tunnel opened into a massive underground cavern, and in the center of it was a river, flowing fast and deep through the heart of the mountain. It was the source of the hidden spring Chayton had guarded. "My God," Caleb breathed. "It's the lost San Pedro." It was a mythical river prospectors had searched for decades, rumored to flow through a rich vein of gold. The Apache gold wasn't a hoard hidden in a cave. It was an entire river, its bed glittering with flakes of the precious metal. The legends were true. The light from the tunnel entrance was suddenly blocked by silhouettes. Cain and his men had followed them. "Nowhere to run now, Junior," Cain's voice boomed, mocking Caleb. "Your father will be disappointed, but he'll be pleased with the gold. We'll tell him you died bravely." They were trapped. The river was too wide and fast to cross, and their enemies were blocking the only way out. But she saw something Cain didn't. On the far side of the river, carved into the cavern wall, were pictographs, images of her people from centuries past. And among them was a depiction of this very cavern. It showed people not crossing the river, but going under it. There had to be an underwater passage. She grabbed Caleb's arm, pointing. "The river," she said. "We go through the river." He looked at her, then at the churning water, then back at the approaching men. It was suicide, but staying here was certain death. "I'll go first," he said. "I'll create a diversion. When they're focused on me, you swim for it, under the water. Aim for the far wall." Before she could argue, he stepped out from behind the rock they were hiding behind and opened fire. Cain's men returned fire, their bullets sparking in the darkness. While their attention was on Caleb, she took a deep breath and slipped into the freezing water. The current was powerful, pulling her downstream. She forced herself to swim downwards, kicking hard, her lungs burning. She swam blind, feeling her way along the rocky bottom, praying she was going in the right direction. Just as her vision started to go black, her hands found it, the smooth, carved entrance to a tunnel. She pulled herself into it, scraping her body on the rock, and a moment later, her head broke the surface in a small, air-filled chamber. She gasped for air, her body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. But there was no time to rest. Where was Caleb? She waited, her heart pounding. Seconds felt like hours. Had he made it, or had Cain's men shot him? Just as she was losing hope, he emerged from the water, gasping, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He'd been shot. "Go!" he choked, pushing her further into the passage. "Don't. Stop." The tunnel continued, sloping upwards. Behind them, they could hear angry shouts. Cain knew they had escaped. He would be looking for another way across. They stumbled through the darkness, Caleb leaning heavily on her, leaving a trail of blood on the stone floor. The tunnel finally opened up, not into another cavern, but into the twilight of the open desert. They were out. They had escaped the canyon. But they had escaped into the middle of nowhere. Caleb was weak from blood loss, and they had no food, no water, and no horses. And Silas Cain, a man who had proven he was almost impossible to kill, was still behind them. As she tried to tend to Caleb's wound, he pressed something into her hand. It was a small, leather-bound journal. "My father's," he said, his voice weak. "I took it from his desk before I left. It has everything in it. His dealings, the names of the politicians he's bribed, the locations of his illegal land grabs, the proof of what he is." It was a confession. A weapon that could destroy the entire Thorn Empire. "If I don't make it," Caleb whispered, "take this. Get it to the U.S. Marshals in Prescott. It's the only way to stop him for good." He was giving her the key to his own father's destruction. Maybe he had changed, or maybe this was his last, desperate attempt at redemption. Before she could answer, they heard the sound of horses. It wasn't Cain. It was a dozen Apache warriors appearing over the ridge like spirits of the dusk. At their lead was Chayton. He wasn't dead, he was wounded, but alive. "The spirits of the mountain do not abandon their own," he said, his eyes finding hers. His warriors had been tracking Cain's party, waiting for the right moment to strike. They had seen the escape from the cliff, had seen Cain follow. They had come to end this. They took Caleb, treating his wound with poultices of herbs that immediately staunched the bleeding. They gave them water and food. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of safety. But it was short-lived. A scout rode in, his face urgent. Cain and his men had found a way out of the canyon. They had captured the horses Chayton's party had left behind, and they were riding hard. Not away, but toward them. Cain wasn't retreating. He was coming to finish the job. He knew he couldn't return to Elias Thorne empty-handed, especially not after discovering a river of gold. He was desperate, and a desperate man is the most dangerous animal in the desert. Chayton made a decision. "We will not fight him here, on open ground," he declared. "He has rifles, and we are few. We will lead him to the valley of the echoing winds." It was a sacred place, a narrow pass flanked by steep, unstable cliffs. A place where a whisper could sound like a roar and a shout could bring the mountain down. It was another trap, a final one. The ride was a blur. She rode beside Chayton, Caleb strapped to another warrior's horse behind them. They reached the valley just as the sun began to set, painting the cliffs in shades of blood and fire. Chayton positioned his warriors high up on the slopes, hidden among the rocks. She stayed below with Caleb, who was now conscious but still weak. They were the bait. Soon they heard the hoofbeats. Cain and his 3 remaining men rode into the pass, their faces grim. They saw her and Caleb, exposed and vulnerable at the far end. Cain raised his rifle, a triumphant sneer on his face. "It's over," he yelled, his voice echoing unnaturally off the canyon walls. "Now!" Chayton's voice roared from the cliffs above, but it wasn't a cry to attack. It was a command to his warriors. They all let out a single, unified shout. The sound, magnified 100 times by the valley's strange acoustics, hit the cliffs like a physical blow. A low rumble started, deep within the rock. Small pebbles began to slide. The rumble grew into a deafening roar. The entire cliff face began to shudder and break apart. An avalanche, a river of rock and stone poured down into the pass. Cain and his men looked up, their faces masks of terror, but it was too late. They and their horses were consumed by the landslide, buried forever under tons of rock. The valley of the echoing winds fell silent. It was over. Silas Cain was gone. They brought Caleb to the hidden sanctuary of Chayton's people, a place of peace and healing. In the weeks that followed, he slowly recovered his strength. And in that time, they talked. He told her everything about his father, about the cruel and demanding world he had grown up in, a world where power was the only virtue. And she told him about her people, about a world where community and spirit were what mattered. They came from different universes, but they had found each other in the chaos. The trust that had been shattered was slowly, cautiously, being rebuilt. It wasn't the innocent trust they had shared on the ranch. It was something stronger, tempered in fire and betrayal, and forged in a shared fight for survival. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, he turned to her. "The journal," he said. "My father's empire is built on the suffering of people like yours. It has to be torn down." She knew he was right. They made a plan. With the help of Chayton's warriors, they would travel to Prescott. They would deliver the journal and tell their story. It was a risk. The law was not always a friend to her people, but it was a risk they had to take. The journey to Prescott was tense, but they arrived without incident. The U.S. Marshal was a hard, skeptical man, but as he read through Elias Thorne's journal, his expression changed from disbelief to cold fury. He listened to her story and to Caleb's confession of his own role. He saw the truth in their eyes. Warrants were issued. The downfall of the Thorne Empire had begun. They never knew the full extent of the fallout. They heard whispers of arrests, of politicians disgraced, of a railroad empire crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. But they didn't stay to watch. Their part was done. They returned to the desert, to the hidden sanctuary of her people. Months later, under a sky full of stars, they were married. Not in a church with a nervous preacher, but under the watchful eyes of the mountains, surrounded by her people. Chayton performed the ceremony, binding them together not with laws and names, but with shared vows of respect and honor. Caleb was no longer the son of a baron or a former Pinkerton. He was just a man who had chosen a new life, a new family. And she was no longer the scorned bride or the hunted fugitive. She was a leader, a survivor, a bridge between two worlds. Her name, Nalin, was spoken with respect. Together, they looked out at the horizon. The desert was still there, vast and dangerous and beautiful. It hadn't made them any promises, but it had given them a chance to fight, a chance to heal, and a chance to build something new from the ashes of the old. Their story was proof that even in the harshest of lands, hope can find a way to take root. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next dive into the strange and mysterious.